To another edition of Eye on the Issues, and today we are talking taxes, for the most part, property taxes. And for many folks out there, they're not fun to pay. And I've paid many in my day, and it's not a good time writing that check or paying it monthly, whatever you have to do. Anyhow, joining us today is Jason Mercier. He is with the Mountain States Policy Center. Jason, thanks for talking to us about this. Why don't you give us a little bit of your background? And I do love your backdrop, by the way.
Thank you, Mike. It's great to be on with you. So the Mountain States Policy Center is kind of a new group on the scene. We're entering our second year, and we cover Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming from a free market perspective. So it's probably going to be your fiscal policy, your tax policy, governance and accountability. And what we've noticed across those mountain states is people have kind of fled the West Coast and moved a little bit towards more affordable. With that comes increased housing prices, increased housing assessments, and sometimes increased property taxes, which I know is a big concern across the areas that we cover.
Yeah, and there's a couple items that I know you're on your website and your organization is involved in. Let's begin with what's called truth in taxation. And I guess it improves, as they say, property tax transparency. Now, what does that really mean?
Yeah, so when you get your property tax bill, your first response is probably to give a cross-eyed look to your assessor. Like, what are you doing? The assessor is not responsible for that property tax bill. You got to think of it as there is a pie, and the assessor, when they make their value on your home or on your business, is kind of dividing up the pie. But the size of that pie is not set by the assessor. It's set by whatever municipality is adopting their budget. It's a budget-driven process. And sometimes the voters themselves set that pie when they approve local levies. So sometimes we're kind of driving our own tax burden when we approve these local levies. So the concept on truth and taxation really just gets to the heart of what's driving that property tax bill. It's not tying anybody's hands. It's not a restriction on the levy lids or on the mills, those things that determine the tax levy. It really is just saying that if a city council, a county council, a school district is going to adopt a budget that's going to require an increase in your property taxes, they send you a postcard. They say, this is how much your property tax is going to increase if we adopt this budget. And they hold a public hearing just on that. This is actually something Utah has been doing since the 1980s. And as you can imagine, when you have that level of transparency, you get a postcard saying, hey, if we adopt this budget, your property tax is going to increase to this. You pay attention, you show up for that hearing, and more times than not, that budget gets a little more responsible in the ask, knowing as a budget writer, I'm going to have that level of transparency with my citizens.
So from what you know, are any other states moving in the direction of Utah to put that in place?
Yeah, there have been a handful of other states that have started to do that. We haven't seen it in the mountain states that we cover, again, Washington, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, but we're hopeful because property taxes are at the top of the agenda for all those legislative sessions. This might be something to look at, because when you talk about like a tax restriction, your county officials, your local government's going to say, why are you tying the hands of local government? We're closest to the people. But at the same time, you don't want those tax increases to happen kind of in a shadow, not being transparent. And that's where this truth in taxation really makes it clear what your budget is doing. And then you have that direct accountability with your local voters.
So for people that haven't drilled down on it or really analyzed it before, what do your property taxes pay for?
Well, property taxes are kind of the tax that most people dislike because they're the most transparent, but they're also the ones that are really close to home. So you're going to be talking about your parks, your libraries, your public safety, fire levies, police levies, school districts, sometimes sewer districts. So pretty much everything happening at the local level is primarily going to be property tax, a little bit of sales tax. Very few local governments have income taxes for a very good reason. It gets into some economic distortions. But because it's kind of that primary driver, it's the one that they go to first to increase. And that's not good or bad. We just want to make sure with that truth in taxation, it's very clear to the taxpayer why that is increasing and who's responsible, right? We don't want to have people getting mad at the assessor. They're just doing their job of dividing that pie. But the size of the pie, that's your local public officials. That's who we need to have that direct conversation with.
And that's where I was going to go next, actually. So if you want to see your property taxes come down, you need to talk to your state representative, your state senators, or anybody else you recommend they talk to.
Well, there are three people that are going to be responsible for your property tax levy. It's going to be, if you have a state one. Now, Idaho doesn't have a state one, but other states do. It'll be your state legislature. The state levies usually go to schools, is what they're for. It's going to be your local officials because they're the ones adopting the budget. And then at the end of the day, sometimes you need to look in the mirror because when you're voting on these local levies, you're driving that property tax increase as well. So you really need to understand what it is that you're voting on and what the impact is on your property tax bill.
And so truth in taxation, I guess that's what it comes down to. And I mean, I love the concept of transparency that so you know exactly what you're going to get if you decide that you want to, hey, I'm going to support the idea that we're going to have a park, a big state park or local park, whatever you want to call it, but it's going to cost me money, and this is how it's going to impact my tax, my property taxes, and I either believe in that or I don't.
Yeah, right now, underneath state open meeting laws, whenever a local government is going to adopt a budget, they have to have a hearing on that. But having a hearing on a budget isn't usually the most transparent way to understand, well, what does that mean to my taxes? So this takes it to the next step and say, if you're going to adopt a budget, it's going to increase the property tax burden. That's what the notice is. That's what the level of detail is. And now you're having a public hearing just on that. And, just the kind of human nature, usually if you have that level of transparency, you get a little more discipline in what you're asking for.
Sure. It sounds like a very well-informed discussion, really from both sides. So now let's talk about, do you know who you are paying your taxes to? Explain that.
Yeah, so, as a taxpayer, when you pay that tax bill, I just know I'm paying them. Am I paying it to the federal government? Am I paying it to the state, the city, the county, the sewer district? And in every state, there are thousands of taxing districts. These are levels of government that have the authority to impose a tax liability on. But again, as a taxpayer, I just don't pay taxes, don't necessarily know to whom. So the concept we have is a tax transparency website where you could go and you could put in your home zip code or your business zip code. You would see every taxing district you're subject to, at which rate, and then have an educational calculator on what that total tax liability is. So A, this gives you that transparency, but B, it starts to get a little bit of tax competition. Let's say you move to city A versus B. How does that change your tax burden? Or I open up my business here versus here. We're really just trying to empower individuals and businesses to really know who's driving the tax liability and then what it could look like if you move to different jurisdictions.
Excellent idea. And so you, let's see, Idaho has done this. Is that correct? Or in the midst of doing, they have a tax transparency website?
Yeah, so we haven't gotten anybody to fully go to it. What Idaho has right now is on the spending side, a fantastic resource driven by the controller. It's called Idaho Transparency. So you can get all the spending details there. The next step is to add the taxing districts. They're trying to do that, but sometimes these small districts don't want to cooperate as much as they should. And that's why we're just encouraging more of a centralized process for it.
Mm-hmm. And what do people learn when they go there in terms of the spending, where essentially every dollar goes spent by the state?
Yeah, I mean, you can do it by government entity, you can do it by program, you can get all the way down to seeing how much did my school district spend at Pizza Hut, right? You can get that level of transparency.
Mm-hmm. What a great idea. Now, let's talk about the taxpayer receipt. Do explain.
Yeah, so this is another one of those transparency concepts. Try to put the budgets into more digestible terms, right? Because at the state level, these budgets can be billions of dollars. That's a little bit hard to understand. Well, what does that mean for me as an individual taxpayer? And the analogy we would draw, again, this is something that Utah has been doing for the last few years. It's kind of like when you go to a grocery store and you get your receipt, you see everything you bought, what it was for, and then what the tax was. And with the taxpayer receipt, this is something that Utah has right now. It's a web portal you can go to. And with some simple demographic information, your household size, household income, your home value, or if you rent, how many cars you have, how often you drive, it'll translate that into, well, here's how much you're paying in property tax, sales tax, income tax, gas tax. You have that broken down in a little receipt. And then it takes the next step and says, well, here's what that would translate to as far as the budget. So your household, based upon your tax liability, well, you spent $50 on roads, or you spent $75 on environmental policies. You spent $300 on schools. So it just kind of takes that $1 billion of budget, puts into a little easier format for folks to understand and kind of personalizes their individual tax liability.
So when, for example, states like, obviously not in the mountain states, but Texas, I know there's been a lot of talk about property tax decreases. I don't know if it's actually gone through, but I know they've been talking a lot about it. It might have. But so when something like that happens, how does the state pull that off?
Well, I mean, you're basically just like with a family budget, you have options. You can either increase your resources, so you can raise your taxes, or you can have some fiscal discipline. And what we've seen in the states that have been enacting a lot of this tax relief, I mean, across the country, you've seen substantial tax relief in sales, property, and income because states have been a little more disciplined and they've done some saving. So as the economy grows, as revenue grows, as a budget writer, I can spend it all, I can save it all, I can do a combination of it, or I can just return it back to the taxpayers. And I think that's what you've seen in states like Texas and then Idaho and even Montana, Wyoming. They decided we're not going to do what California and New York are doing and dramatically increase our spending. We're going to prioritize some of that back and return it to the taxpayers that have been providing a little more than what was necessary for the budget.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. You know, most states have to have, by law, have to have a balanced budget. But the federal government obviously does not. What kind of difference do you think it would make if the federal government had to have a balanced budget?
Well, we wouldn't be seeing the inflation we'd be seeing. We'd have higher GDP. I mean, when you have an unbalanced budget and you have the deficits that unfortunately the U.S. currently has, it's a drag on economic growth. It requires higher interest payments. And as you have higher inflation, that means more of our tax dollars that we're sending to DC are not going to things for new programs or national defense. We're going to pay down debt. And for anybody who has ever had a lot of debt, that's not fun. That's not sustainable. And at some point, that bill comes due, right? You can't get to where your budget continues to move from payments on actual services to debt. That just will drag down your economy so much. There has been an ongoing effort to try to get Congress to do what the states do, to do a balanced budget. Unfortunately, it's going to require a constitutional amendment. We haven't seen them have that appetite, but there is an effort moving amongst the states because under the U.S. Constitution, the states can call a constitutional convention. They can propose their own amendments, and you're seeing a little bit of momentum for that.
Yeah, actually, a coworker or a friend of mine is spearheading that. So the Convention of States Action. So hopefully they get that where they want to go with that. So if you're going to say right now to the people of Wyoming who you're going to be speaking to something about this tax transparency, just give us a kind of define it and summarize it if you could.
Yeah, and with the legislative session starting in Wyoming, everybody from the governor down to the legislative leadership has said property taxes are a high priority. I mean, that is an issue they have heard from the citizens. The concern is how do you address that? Some of the concepts have been looking at something California did in the 70s. That's not a good way to go because you can cause other type of distortions. You can do the tried and true, just rate limits. You can do the mill restrictions. But at the end of the day, if you don't have the transparency that the budget is driving that, you're going to continue to see these taxes increase. And that's why we think something like truth in taxation would kind of be the first step you want to see happen, just so you as a citizen know what your government is doing and what that means for your property tax burden.
Fantastic. So Jason, your organization, let's tell people what website they can go to find out more about what you do.
Yeah, so mountainstatespolicy.org is our website. We have all the stuff on there. We also do bill tracking for every state. So as that Wyoming legislative session starts, we'll have some of those bills available for analysis.
Fantastic. Okay, great. Jason, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. I'm sure we're going to be talking again about some other topics.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it.
Okay. Yep. And if anyone wants to find out more about what's going on in Wyoming, whyliberty.org. Sign up for our newsletter. Once again, whyliberty.org. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks, Mike.